It is 12 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. And this is actually my first webinar, so I'm figuring out how to use the slides. But we'll just start by saying thank you so much, everyone, for coming to today's Lunch and Learn. We are thrilled to be joined by Maine Secretary of State, Matt Dunlap, and Lewiston City Clerk, Kathy Montejo. And they are here to discuss everything you need to know about Maine's July 4th primary and voting in Maine during the pandemic that we're living in today. Okay, next slide, please. Got it, thank you. My name is Maureen Druin, and I am Executive Director of Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Okay, next slide, please. And I am delighted to partner with our allies on this Lunch and Learn. The American Civil Liberties Union of Maine, Gateway Community Services, the League of Women Voters of Maine, the Maine Immigrant Rights Coalition, Planned Parenthood, Maine Action Fund, and represent us on this important conversation. Okay, next slide, please. And just a few technical notes for today's event. You are all muted, but we do want to hear from you. Please send your questions through the chat as they occur to you. You can find this by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. There's a little Q&A at the bottom. We'll keep track of your questions as the presentations go along, and we'll ask the presenters your questions, as many as we can get through at the end. This event is being recorded, and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, along with recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. So I want to thank you all again for joining us, and we're going to turn it over to Mr. Secretary.
Well, well, thank you very much for having us here today. This has been a great opportunity for me, especially as I've had the chance to talk to a lot of different groups using this technology, which I had not heard of prior to the middle of March. And now we use it 2 or 3 times a day, speaking to different groups and kind of going over where we are and what our goals are for the July 14th primary. And so let me just, what we want to do, and Kathy Montejo is one of the best city clerks that we have in the state of Maine. She's been a tremendous leader at the municipal level and is a great partner of ours. As we were talking about this, we made an affirmative decision that we all agree that I talk way too much on these things. So that the plan here is that we're going to go do sort of through a quick overview as just to explain where we are and how we got here, and then really open it up to your questions. And oftentimes we'll get a much more robust discussion that way without me explaining things on a 1, 2, 3 basis. So you may have seen the news that we're in a global pandemic, and that has turned the world a little bit upside down for us. This has been an unusual year on a couple of different fronts for those of us who work in elections. In March, we had the first ever March presidential primary in the state of Maine, and it went a little bit unpredictably in terms of turnout. We had sort of projected, based on the number of absentee ballot requests that we saw in the run-up to the primary election, that we were looking at somewhere around 20% turnout based on those numbers, bearing in mind that we had never done a March presidential primary before, so we didn't have an awful lot to go by. But that seemed to be a pretty good barometer. It usually is. Well, I went down to the town of Arundel on my first swing through polling places, and the clerk there informed us that by 10 a.m. they'd already had about 375 people cast ballots. And I called our deputy, Julie Flynn, who is recognized around the country for her expertise in elections. And I said, Julie, take the playbook and throw it out the window. We have a heavy turnout. So we took some lessons from that, and we're all ready to go back to sort of what we considered a normal world. And that was the regular primary, which typically is somewhere between 15 to 25% turnout, depending on the nature of the contested races, what else is on the ballot, what's happening at the town level. And then the coronavirus struck, and everything changed pretty much overnight. By the middle of March, the governor had declared a civil emergency. The legislature had adjourned about a month early. And we began thinking, what is this primary going to look like? And from there, we began looking at a whole bunch of different scenarios that I'm not going to go over here because I don't want to create confusion. But where we wound up with the governor was it seemed to be very prudent to push back the date of the June 9th primary. We gave her several different dates. She selected July 14th, which unfortunately for me is in the middle of my scheduled vacation that I'm not going to take now. The second one I'm not taking this year. But that's really the major change. In a series of executive orders, the governor has also changed some of the deadlines around requesting an absentee ballot, mailing in a voter registration certificate, and also some of the deadlines that towns face as they are looking at things like consolidating polling stations and making other adjustments as they are confronting a fairly vertical problem with a lack of poll workers, because most of our volunteer poll workers come from the demographics of those who are retired. So you've heard probably an awful lot about absentee ballots versus mail-in ballots, online voter registration versus what we've traditionally done with paper registrations, and why we aren't going in some of these directions. And I'll speak only to online voter registration because I think it captures a couple of the other topics as well. The reason why we're not doing online voter registration is that we lack four things. We lack a legislative mandate to create it. We lack a budget to build it. We lack time to get it done. And we lack the technical people to build it. So, and this is becoming an overused analogy from me, but when we sort of look at these sudden jolts in elections, it's very much akin to what NASA was facing 50 years ago when the Apollo 13 lunar mission was about 3/4 of the way to the moon when they had an accident on the lunar command module and they lost most of their oxygen tanks. So as they already knew, there were no supply depots along the way to the moon. There wasn't a space station around in orbit where they could get more oxygen tanks. They had to figure it out with what they had. And it's one of the greatest moments in American engineering, what they did to bring those 3 astronauts home. And so we kind of draw that parallel that we find ourselves periodically in these Apollo 13 scenarios where we really have to work with what we've got. Now, luckily for us, we have a couple of things that work very much in our favor. That is extraordinarily well-written election laws that have been put together very thoughtfully over many decades, and the partnership of very, very devoted town election officials who make sure that they get this done right. Kathy Montejo and her colleagues around the state pursue perfection in elections with almost religious zeal. So with those things on our side, we feel very confident that the changes that we have made will allow people, any qualified citizen who wishes to do so, to vote unimpeded and without fear in this upcoming election. A couple of the things that we've done, and I'll turn it over to Kathy from there, understanding that this is a medical emergency, really. And I think we need to underscore how much of an emergency this is. Now, I had a high school classmate contact me in the middle of this, and he was captain of our high school soccer team. We were co-captains on the track team. Believe it or not, I used to be an athlete. I've erased all evidence of that through bad habits over the last 35 years. But he reached out to me. He lives in New York, and he said, you know, how is your family? And I said, well, my wife can work from home. She moved her workstation home, and my daughter is finishing up her first semester at the university at home. He said, well, what about you? And I said, well, I'm still going to the office. And he said, Matt, don't screw with this. I got it, and I have never been so sick in all my life. He said, it wasn't a matter of having a bad flu for a few days. We've all had that. He said, I was in bed for 5 weeks, and I could barely move. He recovered, but I think that speaks to the temperament of this particular pandemic, that we are taking these very strong precautions. So along that line, we have, thanks to the federal government and the Congress, we have the CARES Act, which allocated about $400 million across the country for elections. Maine's allocation is about $3.25 million, and it has to be COVID related. So we are providing PPE, personal protective equipment, to all the polling stations in the state. Julie Flynn found a line on pens, similar to this. 8 cents a piece. So we can get about 500,000 of them for about $5,000. So people can vote with their pen and take it with them. We may advise them to bring it back in November, just in case. But some of the other things that we have taken different options on for this cycle, like one of the hotly discussed conversations we've had, and it's involved a lot of the groups that have sponsored this particular webinar, by the way, League of Women Voters, Maine Conservation Voters, the Civil Liberties Union, and others have, we've had regular conference calls. And one of the topics that has come up is sending an absentee ballot application to every voter in the state. That's a little complex because the law anticipates that the voter starts the process and makes a request. So we would need an executive order to deal with that, which would not be a big deal. But it would also cost us about $500,000, which is about the cost of the rest of the primary combined. So we've recommended to the governor that given the fact that this is a predictable, lower turnout election with a closed primary, and although very important bonds, they don't exactly have minstrels writing songs about them, that we should save those resources that are one time and perhaps keep that in reserve for the November election when we anticipate up to 75% turnout or higher. So those are a couple of the changes that we have made and that we haven't made, and that we anticipate revisiting this after the primary and to do more. But we'll do that in consultation with the governor, the legislature, and our town clerks. And that's a segue into the extraordinary and talented Kathy Montejo.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Are you all set, Maureen, if I start out? Great. Okay, thank you, Mr. Secretary. And Abby does have some slides for me. So I was asked to speak on a couple matters regarding election mechanics, and those would be voter registration, discussing how to register to vote, absentee voting, how to request an absentee ballot, what it's going to look like to vote in person at the polls in July, and a discussion regarding a recruitment for election workers. So I'm happy to do all that. So thanks for the invitation. So for voter registration, the state of Maine laws define who can register to vote. They, as far as eligibility, you need to be a citizen of the United States, a resident of the state of Maine, at least 18 years old, but voters who are 16 and 17 are able to pre-register and submit a voter registration card. So that's a fairly new change in law to allow 16-year-olds, so that's a great law change. The number one, I think, takeaway I would love for folks to have from today's webinar is that voter registration can be done at any time. There unfortunately seems to be a myth that voter registration needs to take place at the polling place. And we are trying to get the message out and the word out that voter registration can be done at any time during the calendar year. So we do encourage folks to please take advantage of that and get that done in advance of Election Day. Waiting until Election Day is certainly allowable in the state of Maine, but it does create an additional wait for the voter and for the workers. So we do encourage folks, if they can take care of that ahead of Election Day, to please go ahead and do that. The best way is to go to their town office and fill out a voter registration card. However, we know that not all town offices are currently open. So we do encourage people to call their municipal clerk's office, and their municipal clerk can mail them a blank voter registration card. In Lewiston, we've mailed over 50 of these in the past couple months, so it's very possible. So we encourage people to call their town office, and the town office can mail them a blank voter registration card. In addition, on the Maine Secretary of State's website, people can download and print off a version of a card to fill out and mail in to the town office. That's also acceptable as well. So there are complete directions and instructions on the state website, as well as on the voter registration card itself, letting people know what to do as far as filling out the card. Once they do that and follow the directions, they'll then submit it to the applicable town office. Some common mistakes that we see to reject a card and to not receive a voter registration would be lack of signature. That's the number one item. The signature line is on the back side of the card, and a lot of folks miss that. So we encourage people to not miss or not forget about signing the card. Another common factor we see is when people are writing down their date of birth, they're forgetting to put their year of birth, and they list the current year. So that's another reason that a lot of cards have to be rejected. So we do encourage people, when they're filling out the voter registration card, to remember to sign it and to put their correct year of birth. As far as returning the card, under the governor's orders, the deadline for outside registration has been extended for the July election. It has been extended to July 7th is the deadline. And when I say outside registration, that means voter registration cards that are submitted to the municipal clerk, not when the voter is present. So cards that come either through the mail or hand delivered by a third person. So that deadline for the July election is July 7th. Typically, the deadline is 21 days prior to election day, so the governor has shortened that time frame to make it easier for voters. And then looking forward to November, the Municipal Clerks Association is looking to do something in conjunction with National Voter Registration Day. That is September 22nd. We've never really recognized that day as any sort of event, so we are planning for this year to take a look at National Voter Registration Day and do a lot of outreach and marketing around that to encourage people to get registered to vote for November. Another aspect for July is party enrollment. July, as the secretary noted, is a state primary as well as a state referendum, and a lot of municipalities also have local ballots. So if voters are interested in voting on a political party ballot, they do need to be an enrolled member of that party in order to be entitled to vote on that ballot. We found in March, the secretary was referencing the election in March, many voters voted for the first time in many years. They've been a registered voter and enrolled in a party but hadn't voted in 10 or 20 years. So when they came through the line, they had simply forgotten what party they were enrolled in. The state law does say that there's a 15-day period in order to change parties. So on election day, people can enroll in a party for the first time. They can go from unenrolled to then join a party. What they cannot do on election day by law is change or switch parties. So that does need to be taken care of in advance of election day as well. Probably covers, Abby, the voter registration material, and then we'll move on to absentee voting and how to request an absentee ballot. A lot of people are seeing in the national news media coverage in the last few weeks some problems regarding absentee balloting in some other states. What I'd like to point out is that in a lot of other states, they contract with an outside third-party vendor to distribute their absentee ballots and to fulfill those orders. In the state of Maine, we take care of that directly. The Secretary of State's office handles the distribution of absentee ballots for overseas voters, and the municipalities themselves fulfill the orders for our voters. We don't have a third-party outside vendor taking care of that in Maine. Requests for an absentee ballot can be submitted several months in advance of election day. So certainly for the July 14th election, absentee ballot requests can be submitted now. And for the November election, those can be submitted starting in mid-August. There are several methods in which a voter can request an absentee ballot. They can call their town office over the telephone. The voter themselves must do the verbal request. So the voter can call their town office over the phone and order their ballot that way. The voter or a member of their immediate family can submit a paper application to their municipal clerk's office and order their ballot that way via paper application. Many voters are taking advantage of the online request service that is found on the Secretary of State's website. We are receiving anywhere from 25 to 50 requests a day through that service in Lewiston. So that's a very popular, easy, convenient service to order your absentee ballot that voters are really embracing and appreciating. And then another method is in-person voting, which I know can be difficult in this time as different town offices have different hours and different procedures for entering the town office. Some town offices are open by appointment only. Some will start soon to be open for regular business, for the regular open doors. So just be mindful, and I would recommend that you call your town office first to find out what their process is. Buildings are also going to be limited to the number of people that can enter a building at any one time. So if you are planning to vote by absentee ballot in person, I would recommend calling the town office first, finding out what their hours are, what their procedure is, and allowing some time if you do need to stand in line if they have limited number of people in the building. For the July 14th election, the governor's order also waived the deadline to request an absentee ballot. So there is no deadline to request. Voters can request a ballot up until 7:59 on election day if feasible. Returning an absentee ballot. There are a couple of methods that voters can use to return ballots. They can return them by mail, they can hand deliver them back, or they can use a new Dropbox feature if the municipality is offering a Dropbox service. That is a new change in the law that we're very excited about. All ballots in the state of Maine must be returned by 8 p.m. on election night in order to be counted and tallied. There are no exceptions to that in the state of Maine. So 8 p.m. on election day, all ballots must be back in hand at the municipal clerk's office that issued those. We are strongly recommending that people allow plenty of time for mailing time. In Lewiston, as an example, it takes 5 to 7 days to mail a letter intercity. If we're mailing a letter or an absentee ballot from Lewiston City Hall to a Lewiston resident's home, it takes about 5 to 7 days for that absentee ballot or any piece of mail to arrive. So we are strongly recommending that people allow plenty of time for the mailing. And we are encouraging folks to aim for about a week in advance, so around July 8th, to have their absentee ballot in the mail to assure that it is returned in time. So thank you, Abby. I think that's probably it for the absentee ballot slide. And then we could move on to voting at the polls. Thank you. So what is it going to look like if you go into the polls on July 14th and vote? What the Municipal Clerks Association has been doing is we've been spending a lot of time tracking the national media and news stories to take a look at what our colleagues are doing around the country. And we're really trying to glean some best practices for polling place management from, again, the folks around the country who've already been doing this. So we're trying to learn the lessons that they have already implemented. One of the changes that voters might be seeing is they might be voting in their community in a different location. Some towns have had to change locations because there is not enough space for social distancing in their regular location. So we do encourage people to take a look at where their polling place is, and it might not be the same one that they normally vote in. Towns have also maybe changed locations due to consolidation. So we do encourage folks to pay attention to where their polling place will be for the 14th. Even if it's the same location, it might be rearranged very differently. In Lewiston, we are looking at our arrangement and looking at readjusting that to allow for a longer queuing line. So we do encourage people, when you go into your polling place, pay attention to the signage in the polling place because it might look very different. The social distancing, of course, and the line spacing. All voters will be asked to allow at least 6 feet between each voter. That is clearly going to give the appearance that lines are very long on election day if everyone is spaced at 6 feet apart. So we ask that voters not be discouraged. Normally in Maine, you don't see a lot of lines to go to the polls and vote, which is great. But on the 14th, you might be seeing some long lines that you're not used to seeing. Please don't be discouraged by that. We really think that's probably due to the 6-foot spacing requirements, and we hope that those lines will move smoothly. Voters are going to be asked to wear a mask, probably not required, but asked to wear a mask if they are able to, for the protection of other voters as well as the workers. The polling stations will have the plexiglass barriers that you've been seeing all around at different locations around the state. The Secretary of State's office is providing plexiglass barriers to all municipalities. So the incoming checklist table, the voter registration table, anytime where there's an interface between the worker and the voter, there'll be a plexiglass barrier there. The workers, as the Secretary said, will also be provided with PPE from the Secretary of State's office, and that could be in a variety of forms. We're looking at face shields, masks, gloves, all of that to protect our workers. We're also taking a look at where we can minimize or even eliminate all of the touch points that happen in the course of a voter going through a polling place. So we are trying to analyze all the different opportunities for touch points and how do we minimize those or eliminate them altogether. We're also looking at increased cleaning schedules. An example of that would be cleaning the voter registration booths on a regular basis, perhaps every hour or half hour, maybe even after every voter. We're still trying to figure that out. The booths will be closed down for cleaning, so we'll have rows of booths, but a particular row of booths that might need to be cleaned will be closed down for cleaning. And then we now need to allow those booths time to air dry, because the last thing we want a voter to do is take a paper ballot and put it on a damp surface in the booth, because you really don't want to put a wet ballot through the voting machine. That will absolutely jam. So we need to allow time for the booths to dry after cleaning. We're also looking at using a non-bleached base cleaner to eliminate any odor concerns for voters. The pens, the secretary referenced the pens. We were looking at different options of, do we wipe the pens down after every voter? Do we have a used pen bucket for cleaning? But I think giving away free pens is the ideal way to go. Then that just eliminates other tasks at the polls and frees up the workers for other tasks. So giving out free pens for the voters is great. We're looking at having hand sanitizer at the exit, but not necessarily the entrance. The same reason is if a voter puts on hand sanitizer and then their hands are damp or wet as a result, that might transfer to a paper ballot and get the ballot wet and damp and might jam in the voting machine. So we're looking at possibly having hand sanitizer available, but at the exit and not at the entrance. As far as trying to eliminate some of those touch points, towns are debating whether we want to be issuing the I voted stickers this election. I know that voters love the I voter stickers, but that's just yet another touch point opportunity. Should those be eliminated? How best can we distribute those to make it safer for the voters? Communities love to offer different community-based events in conjunction with voting. I think one of the best things for voting is that it is such a great community-wide event. So you may have PTAs there running bake sales, you may have tables of refreshments and all of that. A lot of those will probably be eliminated, unfortunately, in July, just to, again, eliminate any sort of interaction like that. A lot of places are also going to need to minimize or limit the number of voters that can go into the building space. Again, voting is usually a wonderful, fabulous sense of community, and it is a wonderful time to stop and visit and chat with your neighbors. But we're probably going to be asking voters to please not congregate and to please to come in, vote, and then head out and not take the time to stop and congregate. Again, that will just minimize the number of voters who can go into the building at one time. We're also asking voters to please do a little bit of voter education in advance of voting, and if they have an opportunity to read over the sample ballots in advance, that would be a huge help to us and also to the voters. The sample ballots are available usually on town websites, and then paper copies are available at the town office. We do ask that voters become familiar with the wording of some of the ballot questions. Our goal is for a fast turnaround time when they are in the booth. So we would love for them to be familiar with the ballots before they walk into the polls, then they can get their ballot, go into the booth, and vote right away, and they're not reading it for the first time ever. No, thank you. And then Abby, I think the next slide would be for election workers. So we are putting out a call for election workers for both the July 14th and the November 3rd elections. The election day is the largest one-day event that any city or town administers. And we always joke that it's like throwing a party for a few thousand of our closest friends. So it's a large, large undertaking, and we absolutely need citizens to work at the polls. And we simply just could not administer and run an election without the support of the election workers who are the citizens to work at the polls. So there's a couple of requirements in state law for voters to be able to work at the polls. The workers must be registered voters of the municipality or the county where they'll be working, and they cannot be a candidate or a member of a candidate's immediate family to work at the polls. Some of the duties and tasks of election workers, they will be checking in the voters on the incoming voting list. They'll be distributing ballots. They will be monitoring the voting machine or the ballot box, and they may be helping to tally the results at the end of the night. Some of the benefits to work as an election worker, it's a great opportunity to help their community. It's a chance to see their neighbors. They get to learn some of the behind the scenes election process, which a lot of folks find really interesting. And some of these positions are paid and some are volunteer, depending upon the community. Training is provided and the hours do vary. So we do encourage folks who are interested in signing up to contact their municipal clerk for more specific information. And also we have launched, actually effective today, a new website. It's a joint project of the Maine Municipal Association and the Maine Town and City Clerks Association. And it is a website that lets people know about working at the polls and gives them information to sign up to work. So that link is www.mainelectionworkers.org, and that's kicking off today. So we do encourage people to take a look at that if they would like more information about working at the polls. And then Abby already has the next slide up, which is great, which is really the mechanics of absentee balloting. And we were asked to talk about what happens to an absentee ballot after the voter requests it? Because many, many longtime voters might be voting by absentee ballot for the first time with this election. So they're really curious what happens to the ballot and kind of like the life cycle of an absentee ballot. So the first step will be is that a voter receives their ballots and we are providing a return envelope. So the voter will receive their ballots in the return envelope. The voter will review the instructions, mark their ballot, sign their envelope, and seal it. Then the sealed envelope is returned to the town office, either hand delivery, by mail, drop box if available, and there are instructions on the ballot, on the envelope for how to do that. Once it's received, then the clerk receives the ballot, and then, the clerk will receive the sealed envelope. So then the clerk inspects the sealed envelope. We make sure that the voter's signature is there. We date stamp the envelope. We do not open the envelope at that time. So when the envelope is received with the ballot sealed inside, we're taking a look at the envelope, making sure the outside looks complete with the signature of the voter, and then we'll date stamp the envelope. And then we will log into the state database system for tracking the date that the ballot is received and the method that it is received. And then these sealed envelopes are then filed alphabetically in totes and are locked in either our vault or another secure area that is accessed only by municipal clerk staff. And those sealed envelopes are held until election day, are held for processing. So again, they're not opened until we are processing them. So those sealed envelopes are filed alphabetically in totes, locked in a vault or secure area accessed only by municipal clerk staff and held for processing. Towns do have the option to process absentee ballots early if we notify the Secretary of State's office by the deadline. Towns can process Friday through Monday before a Tuesday election if we notify the state in advance. And then any ballots not processed ahead of election day will be processed on election day. As far as processing of the absentee ballots, and we say processing, it really is a station kind of like an assembly line. So we have several processing stations, so the ballot will go through an assembly line, if you will. The first step is that the election worker reads the name and the address from the envelope out loud. And then another worker with the list will check off the name as a check and balance to make sure that everything matches. And then the envelope is opened and the folded ballots are removed. And then the folded ballots are placed in sorting trays while they are still folded. And this is really the key to the entire system, and it is the key to preserving voter privacy and integrity of the process. The ballot is removed from the envelope, folded, and goes into our sorting tray and still remains folded. And then after maybe 25 or 50 folded ballots are in these trays, then they will be removed and flattened. So the workers who are unflattening those have absolutely no idea which ballot came from which envelope. So that maintains the privacy for the voters. And then after the ballots are flattened, then they're inserted into the voting machines for tallying. That entire process that we just described is a public observation process. Citizens, media, candidates are all welcome to come and watch and observe that. It's important to note that no results are obtained from the machines until after the polls close, and that after the results are obtained, the cast ballots and the envelopes are sealed into a state-issued metal tamper-proof container that has a numbered seal and a numbered padlock, and they're stored in our vault or a secure location for the required retention period, and then after that, they're shredded or destroyed. And finally, we just want to announce that the Secretary of State's office recently launched a new 4-minute video, an animated video depicting the absentee ballot process, and that is available on the Secretary of State's website. So we do encourage people to check that out as well. And I think with that, Maureen, that's probably the bulk of my presentation. So we'll be happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was amazing. That was so much information, really helpful. There have been several questions about whether we can have this, I know that we'll be sharing the recording, but if we could have this information from you, these slides, I think that would be incredibly useful to circulate. So before we get started for the questions and answers, I also know that Matt has answered a couple of the questions through the chat. I just want to stop for a call to action. And as you can imagine, there are two things that we talked about that are really important right now. All about keeping yourself safe and healthy while also exercising your democratic right of voting. The first one is to request your absentee ballot. So the link that you see now on the screen, and that also I believe Will Sedlak and Abby Bradford will be sharing through the chat, is the link that you need to go to at the Secretary of State's office to request your absentee ballot. So we really hope everybody will do that. Second of all, this isn't for everyone. But if you do feel like you're healthy and you want to step up and you want to help out, please do sign up to be a poll worker. I know we have this link that we have up on the screen, and then we also just heard Kathy sharing about a new site that has been created. Did you say just today or yesterday? Today, okay, so I don't think we have that link, but we'll make sure that we have that link to share with everybody after this. So please do consider being a poll worker if you are in a low risk category. All right, so just to get started, a lot of really interesting information being shared in the chat, and it's grouped into some different categories. The first category I'd like to ask both of our speakers, and thank you again, Mr. Secretary, in addition to Kathy, excellent presentation. The first one is in the category of absentee voting, and then we had several questions, and I think one of them is, and I know as soon as this happened, I signed up to get an absentee ballot, and that was back in March, and I haven't received anything. Other people said, I signed up 2 weeks ago, I haven't received anything. So when should we start to worry about not receiving our ballots yet?
So for domestic absentee ballots, and the law is kind of bifurcated this way. So if you can request an absentee ballot anytime within 90 days of the election. One of the first executive orders that the governor issued around elections included an exception for those people who had already requested an absentee ballot in anticipation of a June 9th primary, that they wouldn't have to request it again. So if you requested your absentee ballot back in March and you're wondering what becomes of it, for people in the state of Maine requesting absentee ballots, those are available 30 days before the election. And right now the mail is winding its way through the pipeline to the towns. Many towns already have their ballots and they're preparing to stuff their envelopes and send them to those voters who have already requested them. So you should see it fairly soon. I want to underscore something that Kathy said about making sure that you allow for plenty of time. The Postal Service has consolidated its centralized operation and distribution center in southern Maine. So especially for people who are in other parts of the state, you're going to want to allow a couple of extra days, because we know that there's a few towns that should have had their absentee ballots on the regular schedule today, and they don't have them yet. There's nothing we can do about that. So they're going to start sending them out as soon as they get them. So for military and overseas voters, we were dealing with absentee ballots 45 days prior to the election. So they have a somewhat different set of rules, and they also can come under the emergency provisions of the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, which allows for electronic transmission. So we're not talking about that here. We're just talking about people who want to go ahead and vote and have done with it. When should they see their ballot? They should be seeing it quite soon. And as Kathy said, those have to be in the possession of the clerk by 8 p.m. on election night. Some states allow for postmarks before the election. We do not. It has to be in the hands of the clerk. And I didn't realize that everybody could not see the questions as I was answering them from the ether. I'm still new to Zoom. So some of the questions that we've seen involve drop boxes, as they use in other states that use all mail. We have been preparing guidance for the acquisition and deployment of drop boxes. I know that Lewiston is the first one in line looking for this, and we believe that we can use the CARES money for this to provide drop boxes to the towns. It's going to be a matter of logistics as to whether or not they can get them installed before the July primary. We don't anticipate very many towns being able to do this. It's more realistic that we'll see more of these deployed around the state for the November election. And this may very well become a permanent fixture in our elections. I think it's a good idea. It makes, especially for people who were planning on mailing a ballot and don't want to go to the polls, they can just go to the drop box and drop it, and it's considered as being delivered to the clerk.
Just a couple of questions just on that, because we did have a bunch come in on drop boxes, and this is so tied to absentee ballot voting. So what if one question was, if someone else signs it, let's just say they're shut in, and they just can't go out. And I know a few seniors in my community who are in that situation. Can they give the ballot to someone else to drop it off in either at the town or in the drop box?
Typically for the normal absentee traffic, the voter can designate someone to pick up and drop off their ballot for them. It has to be the same person. So if you're in assisted living, for example, and you've designated a family, you have like a daughter to handle your ballot. And we have, by the way, we have special rules now for assisted living and congregate living facilities. So this would be typical that, like say your daughter would pick up your ballot at the town office, bring it to you, you'd vote it, and then they would return it. With drop boxes, that kind of changes the dynamic a little bit. We like to maintain a chain of custody of ballots. One of the questions that came up was, can you take your ballot and go out to your car and mark it and then return it? Not in the polling place. You can't take a live ballot out of the polling place, but you can go to City Hall and get an absentee ballot on election day, go out to your car and mark it and seal it in the envelope, sign the envelope and return it. We have a couple of different mechanisms, and Kathy is very familiar with this and probably can speak to it much more expertly than I, about how you deal with the signature on the envelope, especially when you have someone who has dexterity issues and may require assistance marking their ballot, or they've made their request over the phone, so you don't have the signature on the request form and to match up against what's on the envelope. Obviously, if somebody other than the voter signs the envelope, that's a bit of a problem for us, and we'll probably segregate that ballot. One of the other questions came up, is there time to cure deficiencies? Very limited amount of time. This is one of the things that we talked about voter registration, having a 21-day mail-in deadline so that if somebody makes a mistake on their registration card, it can be corrected in time for the election. The governor has reduced that time to 7 days, which leaves a very, very narrow window to make any corrections to deficiencies. And the same is true for absentee ballots. And Kathy, if you have anything else to add to that.
Well, I have a clarification question on that maybe, Kathy or Mr. Secretary can answer. So if an absentee ballot, and we'll just say also voter registration card, is rejected, will the town contact me about that and give me an opportunity to fix it?
Yes, we will. So if an absentee ballot envelope comes in and the voter's signature is missing, then we will contact the voter and offer to mail them a duplicate ballot that they can fill out and mail in. But if there's not enough time, then they will come into the office if they're able and sign a new ballot so we can get that taken care of. For voter registration cards, as Matt was talking about, there is a process where we would verify to go through the mail and verify if it's a valid address. And if we need to reject it, then we also contact the voter and let them know why. If they submitted it to Lewiston, but they listed Auburn as their address, or they forgot to sign it, whatever the case may be, we do everything we can to reach out to the voter and clarify that information to get that corrected for them.
Great, that's great. And then as we're talking about voter registration, Maine is one of just a handful of states that doesn't have online voter registration. That I know that at the beginning, when the secretary talked about how, we have technical things, where there are things that we can do this year and then things that we have to look to in the future. Can you just talk a little bit about online voter registration and when you think Maine will be able to institute some of the more modern systems that some of the other states have?
Well, I think it's something we definitely should look to for the future. Again, we're working on a very short rope right now. Not only is there a lack of resources in terms of the technical staff and revenue to do it, the legislature just passed automatic voter registration last year, which we're working on implementing now. And as some of these other ideas have emerged, I know that I've talked with my own folks, we're a big enough agency that we have our own standalone information services shop that does all of our technical work around not only elections and maintaining the central voter registration system, but also the digital archiving system and all the motor vehicle databases around titles, vehicle registrations, and driver's licenses. And we've been implementing the Real ID Act, now automatic voter registration. We did all the technical work on ranked choice voting. And when we offer these new ideas to the staff, they kind of look at me and say, what do you want us to stop doing so we can get this other thing done? And I think, this is a fairly major piece of public policy, which I think the legislature will want to have some shape in, hand in shaping, I should say, and also provide the resources for us to do. So I think it's a little bit out in the future. It's certainly not something we're opposed to. I think if we had it right now, it would answer an awful lot of questions for us. And I totally agree with that. I think we've been spoiled by technological developments that, we do things so well, we do them so quickly that people think it's just a matter of saying go and it's done. And it's not just at all that simple. There was another comment in the text questions that I want to touch on. And that was, the part about people who are 17 now and are going to be 18 before the election. If you're in that demographic, you can register to vote now and you can vote in the party primary as long as you're going to be 18 before the general election. It's a change that was made about maybe 10, 12 years ago. It's something that's great for the young people to get involved. And we were asked to remind folks of that. Another key question we had, and we've been getting this question a lot, in fact, that's all we talked about before the coronavirus pandemic, was cybersecurity and what's happening around the world with Russian intelligence and China and the interference in elections. And that's really more propaganda than anything. I mean, what they're doing is propaganda. They have no impact on our election structures whatsoever. Now, Kathy and I have talked an awful lot about things like the voter list, and we've talked about tabulating machines. The tabulators are plugged into the wall. They are programmed individually. We send nothing over the internet. She gets, the padded envelopes with the memory devices, which are not thumb drives, are much more sophisticated and encrypted devices, programmed by precinct. They're tested by us and by the clerks. And all they do is read the ballot. We still have the paper ballot, and that's the most secure thing that we have in this world of technology. So there's no way for the Russian intelligence to change your vote on your ballot or to change the results of the election. So yes, the central voter registration system does face the internet. That is an area of risk. We watch it like a hungry hawk hovering over a big fat mouse hole every day. And we work very closely with the Department of Homeland Security and our own Office of Information Technology, assessing new threats all the time. Worst case scenario, if there was, like, say, a distributed denial of service attack that completely shut down the central voter registration system before the clerks had a chance to print off their incoming voter lists, which is what they use to check people off as they come in the polling place. We don't have electronic poll books for that very secure, that security reason itself. Well, the worst case scenario, we get a stack of registration cards and we have everybody register all over again. It's not the best way to do it, but every single person who is eligible would still be able to vote, even if they destroyed our voter list. So we have a pretty good system in place, and it's still the voter that controls the outcome of the election. People who see stuff in Facebook and believe it and have their opinions changed by it, well, that's where the Russians succeed. But they can't change the way you mark your ballot unless you want to. There's the old saying, Maureen, that the devil is polite. He only goes where he's welcome. And that's really true in this type of online thrashing that goes on.
Well, I definitely know that's on a lot of people's minds. And I think we could go into this about what about other states and what they do. But I think for right now, we have a couple of other Maine specific states. And if we do have time to get back to that larger national question, I think people would be really interested in hearing your perspective on that. We had a question come in around, what if you're homeless and don't have a permanent address? Can you still register to vote, and how do you do that?
Yes, you can. There is a whole process for determining that type of eligibility. So somebody living under a bridge does still have a fixed in principle residence that they can use for voter registration purposes. Whether, you know, it's a homeless shelter or something like that, if you are over 18 and you're an American citizen, you have the right to vote in the general election. And if you're going to be 18 by the general election, you can vote in this primary election, whether you're homeless or have no fixed address. There's a whole process for the registrar of voters to get you registered. And this is one of the things that we get questioned about a lot. And speaking about the national scene, people see what happens across the country. And we get the question every cycle, how do we handle provisional ballots? Well, it's very simple. We don't have them. So if somebody walks into the polling place, as Kathy advised them to do at 7:59, and they have not registered to vote yet, and they want to participate, they can. There's a whole process for that. But let's add a layer of difficulty. They forgot their wallet, right? So they don't have an ID card. And oh, they don't have anything in their name in terms of a utility bill or other official document. So they can't show that they actually live in the precinct. Do we turn them away? Well, no, they're part of the family. They're American citizens. They get to vote. So there's a whole process to register them with none of the required documents. And then we issue them something called a challenged ballot. And that ballot has a secret number on a piece of tape that it's affixed to. They vote. The ballot is not put aside like it is in other states, waiting for them to prove that they're eligible. It is cast and it is counted. Now, if I happen to be on the ballot and it's an absolute landslide victory, which everyone would predict, then there's no issue. But the registrar will chase down that voter and finish the process to make sure they bring in the documents to make sure that they can complete their registration and be permanently placed on the voter list. Now, if there's a recount, and they do that anyway, they'll do that after the election. But let's just say it's still me on the ballot and I've won by one vote, or I've lost by one vote, and there's a recount. When we do the recount supervisor will announce to the counters that this election has a secret ballot and to be looking for it. And with any luck, by that time, the registrar has already completed the process and we know that the voter is qualified or the voter has disappeared and we can't find them and we can't complete the registration. In that case, the ballot would remain segregated. It would not be a part of the final count. But if they can complete the qualification, that secret number is taken off, the ballot is reshuffled into the pile, and it is a part of the final tabulation pursuant to the recount law. So in any case, the rights of the voter are protected and preserved in every step along the way. And that's something that, while nobody asked it, it is a question we frequently get around the election.
Great, that's really helpful. So if someone is homeless and doesn't have a permanent address, can that person request an absentee ballot? And how do they do that? And maybe Kathy, do you want to answer this one?
Sure, that's fine. Yes, they can register to vote, as the secretary said, and they can request an absentee ballot. We can mail it to the address that they provide. A lot of, at least in larger communities, as Matt said, the homeless shelters serve as sort of the point of contact for the folks, and their mail can go there. So we can mail it to the homeless shelter if that's their request. They can come into the town office and vote. And I would just underscore, as Matt was saying, is that where there are community outreach advocacy groups for homeless residents, they work with their municipality, they work with the municipal clerk's office, we partner, we provide information for them, we provide education, we provide the voter registration cards, so we really do work well. We welcome community advocacy groups to reach out to us in advance, and we can share information and be as helpful as we can.
Makes me really proud to be from Maine, so thank you. Another question, are you accepting high-risk individuals over 65 as poll workers?
It is up to the voter who is going to volunteer to serve at the polls. If someone contacts us, we have been telling them these safeguards that we are looking to put in place. If they are willing to work at the polls, we are not going to turn anyone away. We are certainly going to ask the workers on the morning of election, are they feeling well? If they have not been feeling well, please consider not working at the polls. But most folks, if they are within the at-risk age and if they are willing to work, we are happy to accept them as long as they are comfortable. We want to make sure that our residents who are stepping forward to take care of this task for their fellow residents, we want to make sure that they are well taken care of and respected by the municipality who they are working for. So we want to provide all the safeguards we can.
Great. And will signature collection be allowed at the polls this year?
I think that's going to be on a poll by poll decision. It depends on the room they have, you know, and what we've always done with signature gathering, especially when you have multiple efforts, is that they're allowed to gather signatures at the polling places as long as space is available. And once they run out of space, then whoever comes in last probably gets turned away. So I think if you have a smaller polling station where it's almost impossible to maintain safe social distancing, they may have to go outside. But if there's room and they follow all the Centers for Disease Control guidelines, there's no reason why they can't. But that's, again, that's going to be a judgment call, both for the signature gatherers and the wardens in the polling stations, and as well as the voters themselves as to whether or not they want to be a part of that. We do have one person that's been asking a lot of questions about absentee ballots, especially absentee ballots, picking them up on election day. And yes, you can go to the town office on election day and you can get an absentee ballot, mark it and return it to the town office or take it directly to the polling station if you wish. So we're trying to make this as open-ended for folks as possible.
Great, thank you. Also, I know that I've been reading in the paper about changing polling locations due to COVID-19. I think I read something about the Augusta Civic Center. There might be some changes to allow for more social distancing. How can people find, and how will you publicize? Because I'm used to going up to the elementary school like every election cycle. So how are people going to know where the polling places are, number one, and then also the drop box locations, number two?
Sure. So the municipal clerks will be putting that information out through press releases, through the local media, through their local community newspaper, on the municipal websites, on the municipal social media. Usually also signs at the traditional building will be posted on election day. So a sign, so like you said, your elementary school, there'll probably be a sign on the door on election morning saying, good morning, all voting today is taking place at, and then list that location. So we really try to let voters know at every opportunity.
Also too, I think it's, you know, we've had a lot of questions about, people doing disruptive things at the polling stations, Russian interference, some of the things that the electioneering antics that happen on election day, as well as questions like, what happened to my polling station? Can I get an absentee ballot or not? We have a bipartisan project at the National Association. I'm gonna see if I can get this up so you can see it. And it's the Trusted Info 2020 project. And what this is simply, with all the misinformation that's out there or misunderstandings, if you have questions like this, who do you ask? You call your town clerk. And if your town clerk doesn't know the answer or isn't available, you call the Secretary of State, call your trusted source, your election official. And we've done this truly in response to so much of the real crap that's out on social media, as well as, some of the voting disruption misinformation that has been a historic part of get out the vote campaigns, because getting out the seamy underbelly of getting out the vote is that you're trying to get out your guy's vote, not the other guy's vote. And so you see over-enthusiastic people doing things like saying, election day for one party is on Tuesday, for the other party it's on Wednesday. And people will actually believe stuff like that, and they don't go to vote. Or, the flyers on cars at Bates College a few years ago said if out-of-state students register to vote in Lewiston, then they're gonna have to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in things like excise tax fees for their vehicles and have to re-register everything, get a new driver's license. At the University of Maine, they got an email for non-resident students being told that if they registered to vote in Maine, that they were gonna lose their financial aid packages, which really scares the hell out of an 18-year-old kid and has the desired effect of keeping them from voting. So, that's why we emphasize to folks, if you have questions, ask your trusted source, ask the election official in your town, or the Secretary of State's office if you have questions like this, and we'll try to get you the right answer.
Great. I know we only have 2 minutes. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 questions. One is a yes or no. Will ranked choice voting be allowed in the presidential? The answer is yes, is what I'm seeing. Okay.
We don't know, because there's a people's veto, which is due in our offices on Monday, that if they collect enough signatures, then that'll put a stay on the effectiveness of the law until we certify it. If we certify it, then we would not be using ranked choice voting for the presidential election in November, but we would have a straight up or down vote on whether or not to use ranked choice voting for future presidential elections. If
All
they
right.
don't have enough signatures, then yes, we would use it.
I really appreciate both the panelists for letting me get into these questions because they're all really interesting. The last one is, I think people have looked at Georgia this week and back at Wisconsin, long lines. And so I'm just wondering how you're going to be monitoring the primary and really looking at what needs to be changed for November. You know, because certainly there are going to be new things that are instituted for the Maine elections for the primary and due to COVID-19. And so how are you going to capture that information to change what needs to be changed and to inform November?
I think the most important thing to understand is that we believe the elections belong to the voters, not to anybody else. So everything that we'll be doing to observe and modify any practices between July and November will be with an eye to make things as easy and as accessible for the voter so that they can have confidence that the process works as possible. And if there are issues with lines, then we're going to revisit that for November and make sure that we can mollify that condition and make sure that we don't have the same situation in November. November will be a much, much tougher time. So this is a great opportunity for us to do some of these things almost as a practice run with a lower turnout election.
Well, thank you both so much, Kathy, Montejo. I think we're really lucky to have you in Lewiston. I just have to say that was fabulous. And you too, Mr. Secretary of State Matt Dunlap, we're very lucky to have you too. Just a couple of notes. I know I have here. If you have enjoyed this event, I encourage you to join our future virtual Lunch and Learn events every Friday from 12 to 1. Next week on Friday, June 19th, Corey Hinton and John Banks will talk to us about tribal sovereignty and LD 2094, an act to implement the recommendations of the Task Force on Changes to the Maine Indian Claim Settlement Implementing Act. Corey is a citizen of the Passamaquoddy tribe enrolled at Pleasant Point and an attorney with Drummond Woodsum Law Firm. And John Banks is the director of the Department of Natural Resources for the Penobscot Indian Nation. So we hope you'll join us. You'll also be receiving a quick survey that we hope you fill out after this ends, later this afternoon. The recording will be available on the website. And just a round of applause for our excellent panelists. Thank you so much for coming today. All right, goodbye, everybody. Thank you.